Good evening and welcome to the show. I'm Sharri. Tonight, voters are continuing to turn away from Anthony Albanese with questions over how long his prime ministership will last. Jeff Chambers, Paul Murray and Andrew Carswell are on the show. Plus, a family member of one of the newly freed Israeli hostages tells us what life will be like for his aunt now that her husband, house and community are all gone and her country is at war. The return of the hostages is bittersweet. And former Wentworth MP Dave Sharma joins me live to discuss his return to federal politics after he won the Liberal pre-selection for a Senate seat. But first tonight, news poll today shows voters have abandoned Anthony Albanese, with support for Labor now lower than at the last election. Labor's primary vote is now 31%, falling 4 points in the past 3 weeks in what's been a disastrous period for the government. And The Australian reports that if an election was held today, Labor would lose its majority based on these results. And Anthony Albanese's personal approval ratings are also now at the lowest level since the election at minus 13%. This is all a clear reflection of Albanese's poor performance on a range of issues. And it's starting to cement the impression that he's an incompetent leader who's soft on national security. Among the recent scandals that have cost the Prime Minister's support in today's news poll, the recent immigration scandal that saw rapists and murderers and even child sex offenders free on the streets. Even though the government knew the High Court decision was imminent, it was caught without a plan to protect the community from these hardened criminals. Then there's been the 13 interest rate hikes after Anthony Albanese campaigned heavily on cost of living during the election. But since then, cost of living has only worsened. And the RBA governor just last week warned that inflation is now a homegrown problem. And it can't be blamed purely on overseas factors any longer, with other countries now faring better than Australia in taming inflation. There's also the Prime Minister's clear lack of leadership on stopping anti-Semitism. The Prime Minister said just on Thursday at a visit to the Melbourne Holocaust Museum that he doesn't want anti-Semitism to get a foothold in this country. But that moment for it not getting a foothold is long gone. And it's partly because he failed to take action and to make it clear from the most senior political leader in our country that it's unacceptable and that hate speech will be met with consequences under the law. This has all happened under his watch. His failure of leadership has allowed anti-Semitism to explode onto our streets and online. Albanese and Penny Wong's constant lecturing of Israel over lack of proportionality in civilian deaths, well, this leaves the impression that Israel is committing war crimes, instead of the reality, which is that Israel is taking every possible effort to minimise civilian casualties. Then there's the misinformation bill that Albanese insists on progressing with, even though every single organisation, left and right, are clearly concerned about how it will curtail free speech. And there's also the perception he hasn't been focused on Australians and the issues that matter to them, because he spent a year campaigning for The Voice. And since the referendum, he's been on back-to-back overseas trips. As Simon Benson writes today, Albanese's obsession with the Voice referendum reinforces the perception that he's out of touch with mainstream Australians. And then, finally, most recently, the Prime Minister's lack of courage in failing to directly raise with Chinese President Xi Jinping China's sonar attack on our Navy divers. Albanese didn't even tell the public about this incident until after his press conference at APEC. He deliberately kept it secret in a move that's led to accusations of a lack of transparency and cowardice. Now, Peter Dutton raised this issue at the start of Question Time today, and he had to ask the question several times as the Prime Minister avoided answering it.
Did the Prime Minister personally raise the serious issue of our sailors being harmed with President Xi?
At APEC, there were no bilateral formal meetings between myself and China. I had a range of conversations private conversations with people at APEC, and one of the things that characterises good diplomacy and foreign policy is that when you have a private conversation, just like when I have a private conversation with the Leader of the Opposition, Mr. Speaker, when I have a private conversation with the Leader of the Opposition, it stays private.
So he repeatedly didn't answer the question, and instead Albanese attacked the coalition for its poor relationship with China. But Albanese couldn't say that he raised the issue of the attack on our Navy divers with Xi Jinping because clearly he didn't raise it. Now, this all changes the perception of Albanese in the public mind. He's seen as too weak to stand up to the Chinese president on behalf of our courageous divers. The government comforts itself that Australians wouldn't elect Dutton, that he's so unpopular, but the news poll results show that Labor's primary vote at 31% is below where it was at the election. This is according to the Australian today, while the coalition has built on its own result, lifting to 38%, with, as Benson writes, a leader widely considered unpopular. But the risk for Albanese is that appearing weak on the issue of the immigration scandal, on the issue of the Chinese attack on our divers, well, this starts to turn Dutton's negatives into positives. The image of Peter Dutton as unlikable because he's hard and negative starts to turn into a positive. The public may change their perception of him if they think that, well, they might not like him personally, but he's strong and tough on national security. Well, political editor for The Australian, Simon Benson, writes today that for Labor, a two-term proposition is under threat only midway through the first term in government. Labor now proceeds into the second half of the term on the defensive, with its ascendancy having evaporated at a faster pace than for the Rudd-Gillard government. And he writes that it took Tony Abbott's opposition term almost 3 years to tighten the contest to this point in 2010. Now, the federal government will be looking to reset over the Christmas period, hoping that the holiday break will make people forget the inadequate leadership and the debacles of this year. And while that may be true to some extent, the financial pressures for hundreds of thousands of Australian families sadly aren't going to improve anytime soon. With inflation now a homegrown problem, meaning it's clearly the responsibility of the Albanese government, any Christmas reprieve may be brief. And Jackie Lambie made this point today.
The Prime Minister himself is going to have to be on the ground next year. People are really doing it tough out there. February, March next year is going to be looking really unpleasant for a lot of families out there already doing it tough. They're about to, in the next 4 months, you are really going to see, once you see that, you're going to see those polls moving everywhere, I can tell you, because they're going to want to blame somebody and he is going to get the blame for it.
All right, let's bring in the Australian's chief political correspondent, Jeff Chambers. Jeff, I would love to get your reflection on these news poll numbers today and whether you think the perception is starting to cement that Albanese is an inadequate performer and potentially weak on some of these national security issues.
Hi, Sharri. Well, if you have a close look at the news poll numbers, we started to see them trend downwards from July, and obviously the voice referendum was a big factor, and the view from many voters that the government had taken their eye off the ball when it came to the cost of living crisis. Obviously, off the back of the voice referendum defeat, a very heavy defeat, we've seen the Prime Minister overseas 4 times consecutively. We've had a 13th rate hike, and we've had this culmination, this bottleneck of issues, particularly around national security. We had the first boat that made landfall last week. We've obviously had those detainees released following the High Court decision. So there's this big bottleneck, and it feels like the government's disorganised. They don't have a theme. And I think worryingly, the Prime Minister's only been up for a press conference in the suburbs of Sydney once since he got home from APEC, which was last Thursday. And we've got Parliament back here today. And it just seems like the Prime Minister and his team are trying to work out a way forward. And the way forward is probably going to look like MyEFO in a couple of weeks' time, the mid-year budget update, which is tracking towards a surplus. We've also got the response to the migration review. So the government's eyeing off some of these areas to try and hone their messaging around the cost of living and housing crises. But they just can't seem to get any clear air. And Peter Dutton seems to really be hitting his straps and hitting his lines well, and seems to really claim authority when we're talking about these security issues. Yeah,
and confidence growing as a leader. Now today, Jeff, Andrew Clennell on Sky News revealed that the federal government was secretly trying to secure a deal with the US State Department to resettle the child sex offender who's referred to as NZYQ a month before he won his High Court battle that, as we know, triggered the release of hundreds, 140 at least, criminals onto our streets. Home Affairs Minister Claire O'Neil was allegedly asking for all avenues to be exposed and no stone left unturned to get this criminal detainee, this child sex offender, out of the country. This according to documents filed with the High Court. Jeff, does this expose some contradictions in Labor's argument?
Well, I think their argument has just been so confused. It's hard to get a clear answer on so many of these really sensitive issues that seem to be popping up for the government. It's clear as day that going back months towards June, the government had a very strong understanding that the High Court would be ruling the way that it did ultimately rule. And we'd been expecting that judgment to come out in February. Thankfully, we're going to see that judgment released in full tomorrow. So what that's going to do is going to see a flurry of activity in terms of legislation. We're only slated to sit this week, the Senate next week, and the House was only due to sit one day next Thursday. It's now looking increasingly likely that they're going to have to resolve this matter ASAP. Now, in terms of the affidavits and what's come out in terms of evidence of Claire O'Neil's office and her department and trying to find a third country to send this child rapist, it's quite extraordinary because it really does contradict what they've said publicly in relation to where this landed, which was a complete mess last couple of weeks.
Now, Jeff, finally, Home Affairs Secretary Michael Pezzullo has now been removed from his job. This is after leaked text messages allegedly saw him collude with lobbyists and political power brokers to gain influence. At least this is what the government is claiming. Others say it's just usual Canberra gossip. Michael Pezzullo was someone who was tough on national security as the head of the Home Affairs Department. Do you think the government's made the right call here?
Well, firstly, I think it was pretty clear that the government were out to get Mike Pezzullo. They dismantled his department. They watered down his authority and responsibilities. And there has been accusations that they were behind some sort of conspiracy. In saying all that, obviously, Mike Pezzullo's text messages were extraordinary. The fact that they were leaked and released, extraordinary in themselves. So it got to a point where he had to go. But there are questions over losing someone of his deep experience, particularly in this national security space.
Yeah. Jeff Chambers, thank you so much, and we'll continue reading your excellent reporting in The Australian. Thank you. Now, coming up, a relative of a newly freed Israeli hostage will join me live, and he's going to tell us how his loved one, how his aunt coped when she was underground in those dark Hamas tunnels. Stay tuned. Welcome back. Well, over the weekend, we had the heartwarming news that 3 sets of Israeli hostages have now been freed. And tonight, we're expected to finally see Hamas set free the baby who was taken hostage as a 9-month-old and is now 10 months old. This beautiful, poor, innocent baby who never did anything to deserve this disgusting capture by Hamas, who never should have spent 50 days in shocking conditions. There are now 40 women and children who are back at home with their families in Israel. The Israelis celebrated their return with crowds turning out onto the streets late at night to sing Am Yisrael Chai as they welcomed the hostages home. That song celebrating Israel, its existence and its future. Now, these reunions are heartwarming after 50 days apart, 50 days of being held in underground tunnels, away from sunshine, fresh air, wind, and the love and laughter of sibling and family and friends. 50 days under the control of brutal terrorists. 50 days not knowing whether they would ever see their loved ones again, if they'd ever return to Israel. And even when the hostages were finally freed and they were brought above ground, they didn't know if they were being transported for execution. For the adults, the trauma of knowing that a former hostage, Gilad Shalit, spent 5 years in prison made matters even worse. They know that others never made it out alive. The psychological trauma from this time for both children and adults alike will be immense. The ongoing suffering may never end, it may last their entire lives, and yet they are the lucky ones. Some 200 Israeli hostages are still being held captive by these animals, these terrorists, who are prepared to sacrifice their own civilians as human shields without a second thought. 200 innocent Israelis are still in dark, damp underground tunnels with little food. And for the sons and the brothers and the fathers, there's no plan for the release of the men. And for the Israeli soldiers, both men and women, the reality is they're most likely being tortured and they may never be released. If they are released, the price will be far higher than for the civilians. Yet a lot of the international media, including in Australia, has reported the exchange of criminals from Israeli prisons for innocent Israelis held by Hamas, as though it's some sort of equal deal. There is no equivalence here between the criminals held by Israel who have committed serious crimes, including stabbing and murder, and the innocent women, children, and babies. We are seeing very clearly a terrible double standard when it comes to the treatment of Jews compared with the treatment of any other ethnicity or group in Australia. This post by Green Senator Mehreen Faruqi, where she posed for a photograph, she was smiling beside a student holding up a sign saying, "Jews should get in the bin, keep the world clean from Jews." And not just posing happily beside it, but Mehreen Faruqi uploaded the photograph to her social media account. Eventually, she deleted it. Has she apologised? Well, not that we've seen. We've asked her today if she has apologised, if so, where, and if she was planning on apologise. We've had no response. How can she not have apologised? Well, I'll tell you why. Because much of the mainstream media have simply failed to cover this story, as Paul Murray revealed on his show last night. The left media, like The Guardian and the ABC, are so obsessed with issues of equality and racism, except when it comes to Jews. And then they appear to have no problems with a senator being openly racist. How can they not think this is a big story to cover? A big story. But none of these media outlets are covering it in a major way. So why have so many journalists ignored this very obvious news story about a senator standing next to a sign saying, "Keep the world clean from Jews," when the media was, as Paul Murray pointed out last night, when the media was obsessed with Tony Abbott unwittingly standing in front of a sign that said, "Ditch the witch"? Well, you know why the journalists haven't covered it? Because about 270 of them now have signed a petition calling for reporting on this war to change, to be less sympathetic towards Israel. I don't even know how it's possible to be less sympathetic. These media outlets are already so hostile towards Israel and Jews. They don't believe Israel has a right to defend itself after a terror attack, which killed 1,400 innocent Israelis and saw another 240 innocent women, children and men kidnapped and taken hostage. But these journalists don't want Israel to defend itself. Many of them were demanding a ceasefire from the very start, and they didn't express concern or post on social media about the innocent babies and children who'd been kidnapped or the women who'd been raped, the teenagers who'd been raped. And now they want the media outlets they work for to treat Hamas like Israel. To treat Israel like Hamas. To treat claims from Israel with as much scepticism as you would treat claims from a terrorist organisation. It's unbelievable. The only comfort I can possibly take from this is that there's now a list of the journalists for the world to see, the journalists who've effectively taken a stance against Israel and the Jewish community. Their names are there in black and white. Journalists on the left have turned virtue signalling into an art. They've added pronouns to their email signatures. They've campaigned for ethnic, gender, transgender and sexual diversity in their newsrooms. But again, they don't care about racism or equality or diversity when it comes to Jews. And by the way, how many Jewish people actually work at the ABC and in the Guardian's newsroom? And for those that do, how safe do they feel in that environment? As for the media industry, they had their awards called the Walkleys on Friday night. And as you may have heard, they had a pro-Palestinian activist as co-host. And he demanded that all journalists in the room use their platform to call for a ceasefire. Now, let's be clear, a ceasefire doesn't mean peace. We had a ceasefire on October the 6th. A ceasefire means that Israel should give up on having its hostages returned, should give up on defending its right to exist, should just let its people, Jews, be slaughtered. Now, I wonder how many Jews the Walkleys have on their judging panels. How many Jews who are Zionists do they give awards to? Well, I'll tell you the answer, not many. We saw anti-Semitism at the Walkleys on Friday night, where concern was expressed for those in Gaza, but not those in Israel. Because according to the Walkleys, Jewish lives apparently don't matter. Well, former Labor Senator Stephen Conroy last night made this point about the left, that there's one rule for the Jews and another for any other minority group.
If this was in any way happening to Muslims around mosques, there will be an outcry. And Australians need to stand up, and particularly Australians who believe or think they're on the progressive left side of politics. When you walk in a march, when you stand next to people who are chanting from the river to the sea, you are calling for the extermination of the state of Israel. This is not Labor policy. This is not left policy. You are barracking for Hamas's policy.
Well, there was another brilliant column from the former editor-in-chief of The Australian, Chris Mitchell, in the paper today. And in it, he quoted journalist Barry Weiss from a speech she gave in the wake of Hamas's attacks on Israel. Barry made this brilliant point about the social justice crowd.
Hip young people with pronouns in their bios are not just chanting the slogans of a genocidal death cult. They are going around and tearing down the photographs of women and children who are currently being held hostage in tunnels that run under the Gaza Strip. And they do so gleefully. They laugh. They mock the 9-month-old baby who was stolen from his parents. And in doing so, they are tearing down, or at least they are trying to tear down, the essence of our common humanity. It is a symptom of a much deeper crisis, one that explains how, in the span of a little over 20 years since September 11th, educated people now respond to an act of savagery, not with a defense of civilization, but with a defense of barbarism.
Such a good point. The left has tied itself in knots and has somehow turned innocent victims into oppressors, and has somehow sided with the terrorists who, if allowed, would continue to inflict brutal and unbearable acts of cruelty against Jewish people, not just in Israel, but all over the world. And then after the Jews, it would be anyone who doesn't believe in Islam and doesn't follow their radical rule. The terrorists don't hide this ambition, they boast about it. But none of the woke left seem to care about their murderous intent. Instead, they celebrate it in rallies on the streets of Sydney and Melbourne. And a Greens politician smiles beside an Australian girl holding a sign that says she wants to keep the world clean from Jews. A message from Hamas endorsed by a politician in a mainstream political party. And most of the media don't even blink. They don't think it's worth reporting on. The Prime Minister doesn't condemn it, and that's how anti-Semitism becomes normalised and part of the fabric of Australian life. Now, among the hostages freed, 72-year-old Adina Moshe, who's coming back to no husband, no home and no community after Hamas took all of that away from her. After the joy of being reunited with the family that she does have left, we have to ask what her future and that of many of the other freed hostages looks like. Well, Eyal Nouri is Adina's nephew, and he joins us once again on this show. Eyal, thank you so much for your time. Now, last time you joined us on this program, you were desperate to get your Aunt Adina back. She was luckily one of those freed on the weekend. Tell us how the reunion with her has been for you and her other family.
The reunion was, first of all, when they took her from, after blasting her window and put her bare feet to Gaza, and after she saw her husband murdered, the first thing she saw when she arrived to the hospital was her son, Amos Moshe, who she believed that she didn't know what happened to him. And she thought about the worst of all, but then she saw him, that he is alive. He survived the massacre together with his wife and 5 children. So this was like a powerful beam of light for her in the old darkness around, where she saw him, she hugged him. This was a joyful moment to know that at least her son survived. And this is despite all the things around her, that she lost everything. Starting with her husband, she lived with him 52 years, and she saw him murdered, and she was taken to the Hamas tunnels. She was in the darkness, complete darkness, literally in the darkness, not only in terms of information and knowledge about whatever happening outside, but also about being in the tunnels. But I want to say something about my aunt. She's one of the bravest women. When she went out from the Hamas vehicle, she slapped the Hamas terrorist on his hand because they never managed to break her spirit. Maybe they break her body because they didn't feed her, they didn't treat her well, but they never managed to break her spirit. She slapped him on the hand, she doesn't need his help, and she walked to the Red Cross vehicle.
What an incredible woman. Amazing. I mean, that is the Jewish spirit, isn't it? Now, look, you've just started speaking there about the conditions that she was kept in, dark, not much food. Has she been able to open up to you and her family about how bad it was under there? And can you tell us a bit more detail about what those 50 days were like for Adina, but also for the other children who were there?
I can tell you that my aunt, she worked in education, and she taught a lot of generations of kids in the kibbutz Nir Oz. And when she was in the tunnel, she was the power for the other children. She treated them, she encouraged them, and the condition, if you think about the worst condition, think worse than that. Not knowing nothing about whatever happening in the outside world, treating them in a very bad manner, I don't want to go into details, but the condition was really severe.
Yeah.
It's not like being in a vacation of 50 days.
Yeah. Eyal, I'm so relieved for you and Adina that she's managed to be freed, and now we've just got about 200 more to go. Thank you so much for joining me. And you know, we've been in touch privately as well since you last came up on the show. Since you were last on the show, so I'm so happy to hear your positive story. Now, still to come, New South Wales Police Minister Yasmin Catley puts her foot in it again. She's slammed for encouraging climate protests. Paul Murray and Andrew Carswell will join me next. If you're just tuning in, here are the top 5 stories you need to know. Hamas has released 14 more Israeli hostages and 3 Thais as the US calls for the fighting pause to be extended. Terrorists may be stripped of their dual citizenship under new laws introduced by the government. Home Affairs Secretary Mike Pezzullo is dumped from his job after his alleged leaked text scandal. Treasurer Jim Chalmers looks set to axe his power to override the Reserve Bank's interest rate calls. And former Socceroos and England manager Terry Venables has died aged 80 after a long illness. More than 100 people were arrested over the weekend after a 30-hour climate protest at a port in Newcastle. Climate activists used the kayaks to block the shipping channel at the world's largest coal port. Officers moved in when the group continued to protest beyond their allocated time. 109 people arrested, including a 97-year-old religious leader and 5 children. Now, we know New South Wales Police Minister Yasmin Catley is facing accusations that she's been on the side of protesters, not police, after she told the local Newcastle papers that she applauded those who took to the water to protest.
You know, in this country, we have the right to protest and to activism, and I applaud people for getting involved. I think that it's important that people are having these discussions. We all know where things are headed. I think that it's really appropriate and it's respectful that we get behind and support people to have their freedom of speech in this country.
I mean, the police minister applauding a protest that police have had to arrest 100 people for, it just doesn't make sense. The New South Wales Premier Chris Minns was on with Ben Fordham this morning and he seemed to defend her.
Well, I think if she'd had a time again, she would have used different words, obviously. But I think it's also important to note that the question she was asked, as I understand it, was, these protests are directed at you as a local member of parliament. Are you getting the message? And she was saying, well, look, I understand people protest.
All right, let's get stuck into it with Sky News host Paul Murray. Great to see you on a Monday, and Director of Headline Advisory, Andrew Carswell. Paul, look, this is kind of in defence. How do you have the police minister applauding a protest where her own police have had to arrest 100 people?
Because she's MUA here to stay. Her husband's a life member, father's connected to it. The union movement is desperately relevant to her as a representative of the Hunter region for her pre-selection, all the rest of it. She should not be the police minister of New South Wales. This is yet another reason, right? Her role in the Opera House disgrace on October the 8th, her role in the tasering of the 95-year-old woman. Multiple times this person is not just a minister with training wheels on. She's lost her training wheels, she's lost the wheels, and she's starting to create sparks out the back of the bike. She is hopeless. And we are seeing, as we're seeing at the federal level, at the state level here, yes, there can be new governments, and new governments have a certain licence to make early mistakes. But when you make this many, they're only going to get worse. Chris Minns, who seems to be able to float above this stuff, needs to nip this in the bud, get rid of her.
I think she should have gone after that story I revealed where she said to the Jewish people, she said to a Jewish community leader, you people. I mean,
well, literally, she still thinks, there should be gold stars being handed out because people weren't being injured on that night as the emails were reviewed by the Upper House Committee. She's useless. She's going to continue to be useless. And the people of New South Wales demand that their police force go after ratbags. Now, people have every right to protest, and whatever, this was the most pointless protest I can think of because I'm talking about with the Newcastle stuff, right?
I know what you're saying.
Because It was 2 days, and guess what? The coal moved today. It was pointless. They decided to stick around post 4 o'clock because they wanted to be arrested, because they know they'll find the right lawyer, get the right judge and get let out.
I mean, Andrew Carswell, you know, obviously people do technically have the right to protest. That's what makes us a democracy. But it just feels like there's too many protests. They're interfering in our lives. They're taking place where they shouldn't be taking place, in Jewish suburbs. They're blocking the operation of trade. It's affecting our economy. You know, maybe there should be some rules about where people can protest, because everyone's sick of this.
Well, Sharri, there are multiple levels of stupidity when it comes to this protest in particular. And look, we could talk about the economic side of that as well. I mean, $40 billion worth of coal passes through that port every year. You know, billions and billions of dollars in state royalties and federal government taxes that go to pay for the hospitals, the schools, the infrastructure in Newcastle and throughout the state. So there's that level of stupidity. But there's also the stupidity when it comes to emissions as well. When you stop Australian coal from leaving Newcastle Port, our customers overseas who buy our coal look elsewhere. So they go to Russia, they go to India, they go to Indonesia, where the coal is 3 to 4 more times intense in terms of methane intensity than our met coal or thermal coal. So emissions go up. So well done, protesters. Your little stunt out in the harbour forced emissions up.
Yeah. Paul, you've been reporting on another weak minister in the federal government, Claire O'Neill, Home Affairs Minister. Look, we learned today Mike Puzzulo's gone. He was one individual who had experience and was strong on national security. And then Andrew Clennell also broke this story that Claire O'Neill was trying to relocate a child sex offender, the one who brought the High Court case, into the US. So, you know, do you think the government's been deceptive here?
Well, of course they have, because the problem is that these people were spectacular at being an opposition, right? Where they were able to leverage every perceived or amplify every made-up problem with the previous government, right, as Kazi well knows. But they have failed in their transition to government to understand that it's not just about constantly fighting the last election, right? Like literally Claire O'Neill today is still having a go at Peter Dutton. Now, her positions on this, as they say, more positions than the Kama Sutra, right? Which is that, we thought we'd win, so it doesn't matter anyway. We'd been preparing for months. Well, hang on, why did you let people out without visas? And only today, 3 weeks after, you're starting to find extra money for ankle bracelets. We thought we'd win, but we were trying to get rid of this bloke somewhere else. And even Andrew Giles today, and you know, this we're talking about, you know, dividing grains of sand on a beach here, but still, it's fascinating to see what a government asks themselves in question time, because that's the story they're trying to get out there.
Yeah.
Believe it or not, they had the stones to pretend today that we were the ones passing the laws and it was all Peter Dutton's fault. We're the ones that want to keep people safe. Well, if that's the case, you think that the Western Australian wouldn't have been able to produce reporters who went to those hotels when people came out of detention, where they were able to freely come and go and there wasn't even a security guard. There are literally more security guards at your local shopping centre than there were around these people. That shows they had no idea what's going on.
Andrew Carswell, you are obviously the press secretary for former Prime Minister Scott Morrison. Look, the political tide has really turned for Anthony Albanese. We've seen news poll today, his lowest support, lower than at the last election. Do you expect this will recover over the Christmas period, or do you think the public are starting to make up their minds about Albanese?
Well, we're seeing a government in absolute drift at the moment, and they're desperate to get to the Christmas, New Year break, but I don't think that will be the solve that they're looking for. People are wanting action on cost of living, and they are desperate to get to a summer period where they can have a breather and have a reset. Well, there's no time for a reset. We need action now. That we can't wait till February or March. And so I think there's that slow realisation that this government that set out so well off the front foot has now just drifted along, and people are starting to work out Anthony Albanese. And I can't for the life of me think how they're going to get themselves out of this saga. They're not quick on their feet. The hubris is set in. You can't change hubris. You can't change arrogance. Where do they turn now? What sudden policy they're going to pull out when they've shown no ability to be able to be nimble and introduce policy that will affect change.
Yeah. And also, a lot of the other issues people might forget about over the Christmas period, but they're not going to forget when those bills come rolling in. The cost of living is still a major issue. Inflation now a homegrown problem. Paul Murray, we'll see you tonight at 9 o'clock, and
You're going to play with us on the Man Cave, talking about what happened in Wuhan, the next chapter. 8 o'clock. Make sure you watch it
tomorrow night. 8 o'clock tomorrow night. Paul Murray.
Watch Chris tonight at 8 o'clock. Then that tomorrow night.
Exactly. And Paul tonight at 9. Andrew Carswell, thank you both so much for your time. Now, after the break, Dave Sharma joins me to discuss his return to federal politics. That's after this quick break. Well, Australia's former ambassador to Israel and former Wentworth MP Dave Sharma is returning to politics after winning a Liberal pre-selection over the weekend to replace outgoing Senator Maurice Payne in federal parliament. And he joins me now. Dave Sharma, new senator, congratulations. Are you planning on focusing on foreign policy areas when you return to the Senate? And you've been very vocal in recent weeks in support of Israel since the war has started.
Well, look, certainly, Sharri, that will be one of my areas of interest, but I guess ultimately I'll be guided by what are the priorities of the people of New South Wales. And right now, of course, that's a rising cost of living, lack of housing affordability, increased costs for life's basics, rising prices for fuel, electricity, gas and everything else. And so that will obviously be a big focus of mine as well, and holding the Labor government to account for their failure to control inflation and the failure to address people's cost of living concerns. Yeah.
Now, on the Israel war on Hamas, we've seen over the weekend 3 sets of Israeli hostages released by Hamas as part of this deal. The concern is that there's still more than 190 or 200 hostages who are being held by Hamas. There might be more released if this pause in fighting continues. But I'm hearing that, and I've been reporting, that Hamas doesn't have clarity over where all the hostages are. Some of them might be held by other terrorist groups. Are you concerned that we might not see the return of all of the hostages?
Look, I've been very concerned about the fate of the hostages since they were taken on the 7th of October, Sharri. And I would just say, and it's important to always remind the viewers of this, that the taking of hostages is a war crime, and their continual detention by Hamas is a continuing war crime. So those of people who are always out in the media talking about war crimes and accusing Israel of this should just bear in mind that Hamas is clear of the most flagrant and horrific war crime with its taking of these hostages. Now, some of the hostages have been released, and that is a great thing, but some of them are orphaned. Some of them are the sole surviving family members because their other family members were slaughtered and killed in the communities in which they lived in Israel when this attack happened. And whilst it's great every hostage that has been released has made it out and we don't yet know their health or their whereabouts, I am very worried about what I'm hearing about the other hostages. And also, you know, Hamas does not seem to have the same accounting for them as Israel does. And that begs the question of, have they been killed? Is another group holding them? Who is that other group, and how are we going to negotiate or mediate with that other group for their release?
And it's part of the reason, in all likelihood, why Hamas hasn't allowed the Red Cross in, because, you know, it will become clear just how many hostages they have, and they're using this as leverage over Israel. Dave Sharma, what's your view also on the media bias during this war, in particular this story that we saw front page of The Australian on Saturday, where there's this letter, this petition signed by hundreds of journalists to try and treat Israel like Hamas, with as much scepticism as a terror organisation?
I was really troubled by that letter, Sharon. It's important. I mean, people need to understand that there's a qualitative moral difference here between Hamas, a listed terrorist organisation that cares not a jot for civilian lives, whether it's its own Palestinian civilian lives, or certainly not Israeli civilian lives, and the legitimate armed forces which operate under rules of discipline and laws of armed conflict of a democratic liberal state in Israel. This idea that journalists should be treating Hamas official sources of information with the same degree of credibility as that provided by Israel, it just beggars belief. I mean, Hamas has shown throughout this conflict, including in the early days with its own attack on the Al Arabiya hospital, that it has no compunctions whatsoever about feeding false information to the media to support its propaganda narrative. Now, of course, the media should be treating Hamas information with more scepticism. Yes, they should still be treating Israeli sources of information with scepticism and curiosity and asking questions. But Israel has not shown itself unwilling to answer those questions. And in fact, the briefings you see from the IDF and other senior Israeli government spokespeople and their willingness to go on international media, their willingness to come on shows like yours and expose themselves to that sort of scrutiny and questioning, I think shows you that they are a responsible actor in the information domain, particularly, and the journalists need to reflect that.
Look, just quickly before you go, I've got a documentary on air tomorrow night which continues the investigation into the origins of COVID-19. Do you think that after all these years, 3.5 years now, do you think there should still be a formal international inquiry into how the pandemic began?
Well, absolutely there should be, and that is something that Australia pushed for in the early stages of the pandemic. I mean, I know it's easy now to think, look, the pandemic's behind us, what's the point in having recriminations? But the whole point of these sorts of inquiries is not to conduct recriminations, it's to find out what worked, what didn't, what went wrong, what were the early warning signs that we missed, what response mechanisms worked well, so that we are better prepared for the next pandemic. And I think we should all know after COVID-19 that the next pandemic is not a question of if, it's a question of when, and we need to be better prepared. And being better prepared means understanding how did this disease break out, what were its origins, and what were the things we need to do better next time in terms of detecting and preventing its rapid spread. It was not handled well when it broke out in China. The Chinese authorities masked up the fact that it had escaped. They did not close their borders. They did not share information with the World Health Organization. We all need to learn lessons from that. China's government, yes, but we can all do that around the world.
Absolutely, absolutely. And it might mean changing the type of research that labs globally are doing as well. Dave Sharma, congratulations once again, and thank you so much for your time. And that documentary, What Really Happened in Wuhan, the next chapter, that's airing here on Sky News tomorrow at 8 o'clock, Tuesday at 8 o'clock. I'm going to be revealing more evidence about how a lab leak from the Wuhan Institute of Virology was most likely how this pandemic started, but that it was covered up. We're going to be revealing a conflict of interest by a US intelligence agency official who was also advising the World Health Organization. This is the National Intelligence Council's Director for Global Health Security, Adrian Keane, worked as an independent consultant for the WHO from 2016. Now, you'll remember the United States withdrew from the WHO during the Trump administration after it promoted Chinese disinformation about COVID-19. It insisted the virus wasn't infectious. It advised against travel bans, all contrary to scientific evidence. So her involvement is a clear conflict of interest. One of the people I've interviewed for the documentary is the former Acting Assistant Secretary of State, Thomas DiNanno, and he said that there was really a push from the intelligence community to insist the virus was natural.
I had found out that apparently she was an outside advisor also to the World Health Organization. They are a political agency, they're a UN agency. It's just not appropriate to do work for a foreign power, and that would include the United Nations. She was, I believe, an advocate for zoonosis, but she was very involved in discrediting the information that we were trying to present to the Secretary of State. Clearly, from the get-go, even when the Trump administration was still in office, the DNI was pushing out this notion. It was a natural phenomenon. It was only a natural phenomenon where we now know that they had their own doubts.
And Anthony Fauci's superior, his technical boss, has done his first ever television interview on this topic, and he tells me that he still lies awake at night at 2 and 3 a.m. worrying about the fact that they publicly decided to downplay the lab leak when it was never the case. So you can see what really happened in Wuhan, the next chapter, right here on Sky News tomorrow night at 8 o'clock. That's all we've got time for today. Thank you so much for watching, and here's Peter Credlin.